Welcome, everyone, to the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast, and I am back. This is Andre Joseph of AJ Epyx Productions, and it's been virtually almost a year since my last episode. I've just been so busy and basically just staying in quarantine for as long as I have with this pandemic. I just haven't really had too much time to devote to the podcast as of late. My last episode was really sort of like an impromptu event when Disney had unloaded their investor presentation back in December, and that was all about primarily a lot of what was going to be the future of Marvel and Star Wars and various other properties that Disney owns. So, it's just been quite the ride so far as we've entered into 2021. And I'm going to be quite honest and frank as I proceed in this new episode, which is also kind of an impromptu event. This may be one of the last few Silver Screen Action Figure podcast episodes that I'm going to do. It's not so much a matter of whether or not this show has caught on with anybody. I've been doing this now for 2 years. I've had a lot of fun producing these episodes for you to talk about my memories of the action figures that I collected, going into even franchises and toy lines that I never had a single figure for, but always had that interest in different properties and things that I've seen on the shelves all through my life. But as it so happens in life, things get very hectic. And for me, as a filmmaker, I haven't done too much in the past year. And so I'm trying my best to get back into what I love the most, which is filmmaking. And the Silver Screen Action Figure podcast was always more of a hobby, just to kind of like show other sides of what I'm interested in, that I'm not just, a movie maker, but it's also a lot of what I have been influenced by has always begun with my youth, taking my action figures, whether it's Ghostbusters or G.I. Joe or X-Men, Spider-Man, you name it, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was always playing with my figures and creating stories out of them. And there's only so many stories that I can honestly tell. And to get even deeper into, current day movies and shows that are out there that have action figure lines, it's a little more difficult for me to really get deep into them with great detail. And so, you got guys like the Junk Man and Retro Blasting that I think also go the extra mile in their own ways of going about the details of these figures and different storylines. Just the backstories that go along with the figures and the companies that made them, talking about the packaging. So, like obviously they've got the better resources than I do. I'm just being quite honest. But that doesn't stop me from maybe getting a handful of these in before I decide, yeah, I'm going to call it quits on it. Plus, I already have my commitments with Cinematic Talk with my cousin DJ Dreamer. And there's also another podcast that I'm currently in the early stages of putting together that's a little bit more personal. So to have three, even my commitments with Jeff Galashaw with Unfinished Business, it's a lot. That on top of the film work that I'm trying to do. So, something has to be sacrificed here. And, this is one of those things where I know some people don't like to hear me talk for several hours, but I'm not making this show for them. I'm making it for the people that matter, who like these action figures and like to hear my stories. And that's basically all I'm going to say about that. So I decided for this episode, I'm going to make another detour. Instead of talking about a movie toy line, we're going to talk about a TV based toy line. One in particular that unfortunately never had figures that really saw the light of day, at least not good ones. But there's always light at the end of the tunnel, so, here's hoping that maybe I could take a small part in an effort that one day we'll see these particular characters from this show get produced in sort of like a retro action figure form. So today I'm going to be talking about the 1980s NBC series V. So, for a lot of you millennials who've never heard of this show, you might be aware of the reboot that came out back in 2009 on ABC, but we're going to focus primarily on the original series that show was based on. And just in case, for those of you who don't know anything about this, V was basically, it was a 2 hour, actually no, it was a 4 hour movie event in 1983, the year I was born, that aired on NBC, and the main story dealt with a race of aliens that come onto Earth in various motherships all across the world. And when they're revealed, they have human skin just like us, they talk like us, although their voices are synthesized. And they basically come to Earth to say, we're going to help you with all your problems. We're going to cure your diseases. We're going to improve your technology. We're going to make life better for everybody in America and around the world. And all we're looking for is just your resources so our people can survive. Now, there's also that level of suspicion among certain humans, particularly scientists, who want to know the DNA of these aliens. Where exactly did they come from? Why are they so helpful with us? And they start disappearing one by one. And among the storylines that end up taking place, it all kind of builds up to where you have, the most unlikely people, and particularly in the setting of Los Angeles, who come together and form a resistance when they soon discover the real intent of these visitors, that they're actually not friendly and they don't exactly have their DNA. Instead, they're really lizards under human skin who are out to take humans for food, as well as animals and insects. They're sucking the water out of our reservoirs, and basically they're going to suck us dry until they decide to go to the next planet and destroy that too. So the whole show originally came from the mind of Kenneth Johnson, who created the 1970s Incredible Hulk television series for CBS. And NBC had commissioned him to produce a show that was essentially, originally it was supposed to be about the Nazi occupation of Germany in the 1930s. And, it was going to be like this big 4 hour movie event based on that particular incident, the rise of the Nazi regime. But Johnson thought it would be more interesting if you did it more in a sci-fi type of direction and used the Nazi aspect of it as sort of, you know, let's replace the Nazis with these aliens, and let's replace the Jews with these scientists and doctors that are getting too close to the truth, and they're being the ones that, the visitors are saying, don't trust these people. They're out to, harm us and harm our, arrangements for peace. And so all that kind of came together in what was an epic event for that time. It was one of the highest rated motion picture miniseries events of the day. Because keep in mind, in '83, you had Return of the Jedi, so Star Wars was still very popular. And this was pretty much almost like, outside of Battlestar Galactica, this was like the closest to another Star Wars type franchise for the small screen. And it was expensive to do. The effects cost a couple $1,000s at that time. People remember Jane Badler's Diana when she ate the rat for the first time, how that freaked out everybody in America. And so many different miniatures and, matte paintings, and so many things that were done on what felt like a big budget that would be normally reserved for a feature film, but in this case it was for a big television event. And so, it was a big deal. And then you had the sequel, V the Final Battle, which came out a year later, and that was a 6 hour movie that spanned over 3 nights. And that was at least advertised to be the final battle between the resistance and the visitors. But that would not be the case because NBC had their own plans, and in this case, they wanted a television series to come about right after this. And that's what we got from 1984 to 1985. We had the V television series that aired on Friday nights. And, by the time of Be the Final Battle, Kenneth Johnson was not involved because of, budgetary constraints that were going to affect the quality of the production, not to mention the fact that he felt that the show should not be a weekly series, but it should be a bi-weekly event. So maybe like have a new episode once a month, maybe twice a month, and that way the quality of the show could still be maintained. But NBC wanted a regular series. He didn't want to play ball, so he walked away and pretty much disowned anything that came after that original 4-hour miniseries. And so what we're going to talk about here is the action figure line that was planned and the very little that was released during this period. So, of course, when V became a big hit the first time, NBC saw the dollar signs and they really believed this was going to be another Star Wars level franchise for them. And so where are you going to go and cut a deal to make some action figures in this day? You can't go to Kenner because Kenner has Star Wars, and they were still making figures well into 1985, 1986. So you had to go to another company that was also, producing toys at this time. Not Galoob, not Tonka. They went to the dreaded Rainbow, LJN. So LJN would be awarded the license for the V action figures. And by the way, if you've ever seen the original miniseries, there's a scene in which you see Mike Donovan, played by Mark Singer. You see his son playing with what appears to be a visitor action figure and one of the motherships, or at least the sub motherships that the visitors would ride on. And many people believed that that was what was going to be sold in the stores if the thing was a hit. But that wasn't the case. That was produced specifically for the TV show. It was not produced to be sold in stores, although that didn't mean that they weren't going to do something like that in LJN's case. Right around Toy Fair 1985, they started to release the photographs of what was going to be the V action figure line. And these figures were roughly the same size as the Batman toys that came later. They were supposed to be like 3 inches. I believe if you've ever played with the toys from the David Lynch Dune movie, or if you ever played with the Temple of Doom figures, both of which were made by LJN, they would be roughly about the size of what the V figures were supposed to be. 4 figures were planned at the time. Mike Donovan, played by Mark Singer, Kyle Bates, played by Jeff Yeager, so those were your Resistance characters. On the visitor side, you had Diana, played by Jane Badler. You had a visitor shock trooper with the helmet and the laser gun. And I believe both of the visitor figures were able to have their faces removed so they could reveal the lizard inside. And there were vehicles planned for both factions. So the visitors were supposed to get this battle Chevrolet Camaro in blue that had a machine gun on the front, while the visitors got a visitor Jeep and they got one of their shuttlecrafts. Those would have been absolutely cool to have, although the Camaro did not exist on the show and pretty much feels like this would be something out of Mask instead of V. And basically, I think they were probably going to put out other figures should had it been more successful, because in that same Toy Fair catalog, you saw pictures of some of the other characters, such as Ham Tyler, played by Michael Ironside, who you probably remember as Richter from Total Recall. He was set to have maybe his own figure just from looking at these pictures. Perhaps more visitors that were going to be just, regular shock troopers without the vests and so forth. And then, of course, what we got out of this was the 12-inch doll. And that's probably the most remembered thing about the V action figures. And that actually did make it to the shelves because, after all, LJN, they had the Michael Jackson dolls, they had the Brooke Shields dolls. I think later they made dolls for FloJo. So they were definitely in the doll business. V was no exception here. And it's a really good looking figure that gets the costume perfect. It's got the boots. It has a human skin mask that it wears with the aviator glasses, and then you can remove the mask to reveal the lizard inside. So it's a pretty wild item. It's commonly found on eBay, and prices usually range from 50 upwards to a couple $100 a piece, especially if you could get it in a box. I happened to get it in one of these stores in the village that used to sell collectible vintage toys. Me and my dad back in the late 90s were able to find it, and it was not cheap to get. And just to say, speaking of my dad, he's the reason I got into V to begin with. And that started because I think I was still in my Star Wars phase in the 90s, right before the special editions came out. And he was telling me about this show V that was on TV back in the day and talking about how great it was. And, like I had never heard about this thing. So at our local Blockbuster video, they had the 4-hour movie on VHS, and we rented it and we watched it. I don't remember getting into it that much the first time I saw it. It was sort of like, I'm kind of into my own stuff. But then Independence Day came out, and that kind of reignited the interest in the alien invasion genre. And that's when the Sci Fi Channel decided they were going to start playing the original television series on every day. And so I found myself after school all of a sudden watching the V television series, and then I started to get into it. And then rented the final battle from Blockbuster, and then I was confused with the timeline until I figured it out going on the internet. And years later, I actually did get to speak to Kenneth Johnson via email because I had gotten the V DVD when it came out, the 4-hour movie, and he did the audio commentary track. So at the end of the track, he left his email address for anybody who wanted to contact him. And so I did so, and then he got back to me, and I just told him my appreciation for it. I asked him a bunch of questions about, why he didn't do the final battle, what ideas he had in mind, if he had continued doing the show. So that was really cool. And, if Kenneth Johnson ever listens to this, thank you. And thank you for some of the filmmaking advice that he gave me back then, because I was in college at the time, and his advice was invaluable to me for being one of the very first real successful filmmakers that I've ever had any contact with. I haven't been able to speak to him since then, but if he's listening, thank you so much for that. Also, too, just to let you guys know, he wrote a book called V, the Second Generation, back in the 2000s, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. So those were the figures that were planned, and like I said, only the doll was released to the public. I believe the figures were supposed to come out probably around the summer of '85, and Jane Badler had went on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and she actually showed off some of the figures as it looked as if they were going to get released. So she had the prototypes, but the V series just did not catch on. By the time it came out, I think people were fatigued with the storyline. They didn't know where it was going. It seemed like, the final battle was supposed to be the final battle, but we're keeping the battle going for some reason. And plus the cost of doing the show weekly, and it definitely had a quality loss that Kenneth Johnson had feared. NBC just drastically canceled it right away in the spring of '85, and they canceled it on a cliffhanger. So, there was this whole story that they had throughout the series with uh, this Star Child character who was basically a child that was the seed of a visitor alien and one of these daughters of a resistance member. And they decided to do sort of like the Christ-like metaphor with this character having these magical powers, and she could be the one that could deal the final blow to the visitors. And so the last episode was supposed to be of her going to meet the visitor leader that we never see but is always spoken about. And she gets on a ship, apparently Diana had put a bomb in the ship, so we don't know what happens after that. DC Comics actually did a tie-in V comic book at that time, and they were able to sort of put some pieces together. Sometimes the issues came out maybe a little later than the episodes, but if you ever read the comic books, they actually have a conclusion to how they would have seen the series end. So those are not too hard to find. If you go to your local comic shop or if you go on eBay, they're relatively cheap to get if you ever want to read on that. But when the show got canceled, I think that was it for LJN doing any V action figures. Because what's the point of having them out if there's not going to be a second season? But they wouldn't be the only company that would make the attempt to make toys for this particular show. So if you lived in Spain or if you lived in Central America, there was a company called Rack Toys, and they were able to make four V figures that were in PVC form. I'm going to be honest, they're not the greatest to look at. They look like a bunch of little toy erasers, and they definitely don't have a great deal of detail. They're only just good to have if you just love the show and you just had the need to want to play with the characters from it. But in this toy line, you had Mike Donovan, you had Julie Parrish, who was the other Resistance leader and his love interest on the show. You had a Diana figure, and then you had a Visitor figure that just has the lizard head and the uniform on. So these figures don't move. They're really, really small. And again, they were only available mostly like in Central America or in Spain. And they are available on eBay as well, but they do also carry a big price tag. I've only been fortunate to get the Mike Donovan figure as a birthday gift many years ago. I've been wanting to get the others ever since, but just haven't had the money or the time to really go and grab them, nor the urge to do so because honestly, I'm not taking them out of the package. I'm not playing with them, and it's just the detail is just not great. And granted, in the 80s, you had a lot of action figures that weren't exactly accurate to what the actors look like on the movies or the TV shows, but you still had enough appreciation to want to buy them and reenact whatever you saw on TV or do your own dream scenario. These you really couldn't do it with, and so this was all we were ever going to get of action figures in the 1980s. Now, outside of the dolls and the action figures, there were also some accessories that kids could play with. Remember, this was the 1980s. This was the era of LJN's Intertech with their water guns that, a number of criminals had used to knock off some 7-Elevens and resulted in bans within our government to make all toy guns outlawed, or at least color them orange so that way nobody gets arrested or killed. In 1985, 1986, you had a company called Arco, and they made a number of V toy guns. You had a friction powered rapid fire machine gun that I guess was supposed to represent a resistance weapon. There was the Resistance Defender rifle, which was one of those like sniper rifles that you put together. You put together the front and the back. You could use it as a regular pistol, or you could put the parts together to make it into a sniper rifle. And there was apparently the Visitor laser gun, which I have here. I got on eBay, but they also wound up repackaging this very gun for other toy lines. So Arco also had the toy rights for Robotech, and later they had the toy rights for Bravestar, and they took the Visitor laser gun and repurposed it into just a generic laser gun for those toy lines, which is kind of interesting. And even more interesting than that was the fact that the Visitor laser gun and pulse rifle would be recycled for another 80s treasure, Masters of the Universe, the movie. So if you remember Skeletor's henchmen, they all have the same laser guns as the visitors from V, if you look very closely. And I think Mattel may have sold some toys for that, but I can't really confirm it here. But as I see in front of me, that's what they were doing, much like what Kenner would do with a lot of Star Wars toys, where they took some of the accessories of Star Wars laser guns and then repurposed them into uh, bat weapons for the Batman line years later. So it's just to save costs. They own the molds, so why not just recycle them, repurpose them, and they'll probably think that kids will be dumb enough to not tell the difference. Now, you go online, you go on eBay, you're going to find plenty of amazing sculptors out there and people who make custom toys who have spent many years making customized V action figures, some of which have the Kenner look, some of them are dolls, some of them look like Funko reaction figures, and God willing, Funko will ever, or actually not Funko, they're owned by Super 7. Let's make that distinction clear. But hopefully, Super 7 could maybe take a stab at making some visitor toys. There's even, reportedly some of the prototypes that LJN had that sometimes show up on eBay, and they're not painted over. So if you could find them, you could buy them, you could repaint them, you could sell them for, double the cost, but they exist. And yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not the only one that would be desperate to have more of these action figures. But you got to remember too, LJN, it wasn't just the fact that V was unsuccessful on television, but it was also the simple fact that LJN was just doing a piss poor job when it came to most toy lines, that they just announced stuff that they didn't complete. And I can tell you that Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom, Dune, even the wrestling figures had a number of prototypes that you've only seen in the Toy Fair catalog but would never see the light of day. And part of it was just, poor sales. Another part of it was probably the stuff that happened later on with them when they were the subject of all these lawsuits with their Entertech line, and it bankrupted the toy division to where they sold off to Acclaim in the late 80s, and Acclaim got rid of the toy division and made LJN exclusively a video game company. It's a shame, but that was kind of the reality of the business back then. And V kind of went along with it. It disappeared for the longest time. There was always discussions of reviving it, trying to continue V. There was at one point talk of a new series in the 90s that was going to be a continuation. That never got off the ground. And Kenneth Johnson, as I mentioned earlier, wrote a book called V, the Second Generation, which, believe it or not, was his plan for a direct sequel to his original miniseries. And he was in talks with NBC to produce this back in 2002 or 2003. But they just, for whatever reason, I guess down to cost, down to interest, decided not to do this. And rather than try so hard to get the sequel book put together as a movie, he just released it as a book. And so if you ever read it, you'll probably be surprised that he gets away from certain concepts that were implemented into the final battle in the regular television series. Certain characters that died in the show were brought back, and it's a pretty cool read if you want to check it out. And it has most of the key players in it, so it's like sort of one of those what could have been scenarios of what the creator would have envisioned if he had his way to continue it. And as I mentioned also at the beginning, you had the series in 2009 with Marina Brocklin. Sorry, forgive me for saying your last name wrong, but Scott Wolf, Morris Chestnut, Elizabeth Mitchell, they were all on the television series that was a reboot of the original V miniseries, and Jane Badler would actually reprise a different version of her Diana character in the second season. But once again, it was one of those shows that initially had interest, but then after a while nobody cared. And I personally thought that the script writing on the show was downright terrible. They never really got it together. a lot of storyline issues and changes in characters that I just felt really turned off the audience. And yeah, just 2 seasons, and I know there was a big campaign to get it back on, but it was unsuccessful, and that was that. While Kenneth Johnson has been spending the last decade trying to make V into a full length feature film for cinemas because he owns the movie rights, and he's been campaigning to get that going, working with different studios. But as of now, nothing has come of it. If it ever happens, I don't imagine that he would be involved, maybe in a producer capacity, but I don't think he would direct it. And and that's really that as far as like the future of the it will probably be a while before we ever see another iteration of it. And then recently, I was pretty shocked earlier this year when I was online, and I collect a little bit of Funko Pops here and there. I've got ones from Bad Boys and Miami Vice and Beverly Hills Cop and Ghostbusters, and I was pretty shocked. When I saw that Funko went ahead and made pops from V. So they had a Diana pop, they had a Visitor with the face ripped open, and they have a Mike Donovan. So as soon as I saw these in entertainmentearth.com, I had to get them right away. So they're sitting in my same cabinet where I hold my awards from the film festivals, and I was like, this is pretty damn cool. This is almost like kind of bringing everything full circle for me. If I never get retro style figures, this is the closest that I'll get. And the Funko Pops, as we know, are very addicting. And maybe one of these days we'll do a whole episode about the pops, because I know a lot of people who collect them, and it's a big thing. And yeah, and it's just like a cool thing to have. And it shows that there is still a fan base out there that loves and appreciates V. And so that's all that I'm going to say about that today. And my hope from this podcast, and actually, this is honestly one of the reasons why I created this, was to see if somehow I could generate some interest in, maybe Super 7 gets their hands on the blueprints for the LJNs and recreates them for their Super 7 reaction line, or just makes something entirely fresh and feels like, I'm a kid again in the 80s going to Toys R Us. It raises the scene that if that ever happens, but man, it's just such a cool thing to see, just to go back by memory lane to see like these figures or what could have been, and just the imagination of it all. And yeah, if you've never seen the original series, check it out. I'm sure, I don't know if HBO Max has it because it was a Warner Brothers production, but certainly it's not hard to find if you want to get it on DVD. Both the series as well as the original movie and the final battle are all on DVD. They're all on VHS, so they shouldn't be expensive to get. I know I got the box set in Boston for a pretty cheap price when I was in college, so I'm sure it's a lot cheaper now. And that's basically about it. So as always, you can follow the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and continue to follow also Cinematic Talk. We have our website up, cinematictalk.com, and we're not just talking about toys there. We're talking about movies. We're talking about current events in film. Jeff Galashow and I still do unfinished business, so we're reviewing movies, we're doing deep dives, and we got some surprises in store for that, and maybe even a little bit of surprise here down the line before it's over. But yeah, I may do a couple more of these before I'm out, before I call it quits, but I definitely wanted to make sure if this was going to be one of the last ones that it had to be V, just because it really is one of those shows that I have a real appreciation for, and certainly it would be my hope that maybe other people will rediscover this as well, especially if you weren't born in the 80s and you're just looking for something different in the midst of this pandemic, which is thankfully at the end of the tunnel with the light. But that's that, so check it out. Check out V, and yeah, make a petition to get the figures redone in some way, shape, or form. All right, guys. Until next time, I'll see you at the movies.